Hello, and welcome to the second webinar in our Fall 2016 Sped Ahead series, Results Matter, Closing the Achievement Gap. I'm Clay Whitehead, the co-founder and co-CEO of Presence Learning. We've sponsored this program for over 3 years, and the flood of positive feedback that you provided after Ross Green's presentation last spring on solving behavior problems helped pave the way for this series. Closing the achievement gap and helping you get better results in your schools is our passion. So I think it is very appropriate as a name for our series. The achievement gap and the challenges we face in getting results from our work in special education are what researchers at Harvard say are, quote, rooted in a complex combination of historically anchored factors that interact systematically across virtually every institution in our society. Consequently, it's a daunting challenge to raise achievement levels and narrow the gap between kids on IEPs and their non-IEP classmates. And, as we all know, there is a disproportionate representation of students of color among students with disabilities. We started the series with Dr. Alan Coulter by taking a close look at the gaps between these groups of students. Alan updated us on results-driven accountability, the federal policy that is shifting the focus of special education to being accountable for student learning outcomes, not just compliance. It was a lot to take in. A lot of good content, but a lot to take in. So I encourage you to watch and listen to the recording if you've missed it, and to recommend it to your colleagues. It's available on demand right now on presencelearning.com. Now, for the second part of the series, we have a natural flow from Alan's presentation to thinking about how a multi-tiered system of support helps shift our attention from compliance to results, and how we can rethink education and the way we view all of our students. Dr. Kim Gibbons, a well-known expert on this topic, is here with us to share her experiences and insights into MTSS and how and why sustaining this framework will help us close the achievement gap. We invite you back in December as we close out the series with Dr. Mary Morningstar. Helping students transition from high school to college or a career has been one of the top webinar requests for the past 2 years. So here you have it. Dr. Morningstar is one of our country's top experts on transition, so this is one you're not going to want to miss. Please register and spread the word. Now, I'd like to welcome and tell you a little bit about our presenter, Dr. Kimberly Gibbons. Kim is the Associate Director of the Center of Applied Research and Educational Improvement at the University of Minnesota. She previously served as the Executive Director of the St. Croix River Education District in Rush City, Minnesota. SCRED has received national recognition for its use of the Response to Intervention framework. Kim obtained her doctoral degree in school psychology from the University of Oregon, where she received extensive training in the problem-solving model, curriculum-based measurement, and research-based instructional practices. She has worked as a Director of Special Education, Staff Development Coordinator, and School Psychologist. She is active in state leadership and is the past president of the Minnesota Association of Special Educators. She is the author or co-author of 4 books and has numerous other peer-reviewed publications under her belt. She is also a sought-after consultant who has given numerous workshops throughout the nation. Kim, welcome. It's over to you.
Thank you, Clay, for your nice introduction and for giving me the opportunity to do this webinar. Alan Coulter's presentation was terrific and is a great lead-in for the topic today. As Clay mentioned, I've spent the majority of my career working in schools to implement and sustain what is now known as an MTSS framework. When I first started in education over 20 years ago, MTSS, or response to intervention, weren't terms that were used. We simply called what we were doing database decision-making using a problem-solving model. With that said, I've got a great deal of experience both with what works and what doesn't work as it pertains to implementation and sustainability, and I'm happy to share these experiences with you today. We're going to be talking about the 5 areas of MTSS implementation and hopefully give you time to review and reflect on elements needed to lead and sustain MTSS in your district.
Throughout the presentation, I'll be referring to a range of resources that you'll find in your handout packet.
Today's webinar will be divided into 3 parts. Part 1 will provide information on key elements and assumptions of MTSS and why it is important. Part 2 will focus on the 5 areas of implementation, and the third part will focus on fidelity and evaluation.
Okay, here we go with part one. I'll unpack the big ideas that you can take away with you from this webinar, and you'll be able to answer a couple of important questions. What is MTSS, and why is it important to closing the achievement gap?
I'd like to just start with a fictional story called Lost in the Woods. A group of managers got lost in the woods. Undaunted, they organized into several teams and began hacking a path through the dense undergrowth. Hours passed, but the managers were cheerful. They had become an efficient operating unit, and they were proud of their achievement. One of the group decided to climb a tree to see how far they had come, but the woman shouted down, "Stop! We're headed in the wrong direction. We have to change course." The managers shook their heads in disbelief and defiance and said, "But we can't stop now. We're making great progress." So why would I share that story? The moral of the story is that it's hard to give up what we do well, even if it's no longer relevant. And the challenge is that we have to continually reassess our direction and make sure that we're implementing research-based instructional strategies to increase achievement levels of all students. When you listened to Dr. Coulter's presentation, he mentioned that one of the principles of RDA is to align as much effort as possible around what is most likely to improve results and reduce the achievement gap. So we think about MTSS as an economic engine to improve outcomes, and I'd like to just spend a minute to talk about how the terms MTSS and RTI evolved and what this means. So let's do a quick history lesson, and we'll start with a student named Buddy, and what to do with Buddy. He's in first grade, he's falling behind in reading, making slow progress compared to his peers. He's likely to miss the benchmarks related to passing the third grade reading test. He's distractible, he's inattentive, he's disruptive. Some of you are probably shaking your heads thinking that this sounds familiar, but what happens to students like Buddy next has largely been driven by federal legislation for the past 30 years.
When IDEA was reauthorized in 2004, it was expected that the federal government would pay 40% of the excess cost of special education services. Right now, the federal share is about 16%, and we're spending around $11 billion on special education.
So when you look at that largest category, SLD, 90% of students in that category receive services because they can't read. And we keep putting more and more kids into special education without any results. So the federal administration's solution to the funding problem was to resolve the issue of over-identification in the area of LD and come up with a preventative model where we could teach kids using scientifically based instructional practices in reading and math and utilize assessments to catch problems early and intervene without requiring students to wait to fail to receive special ed services. So this is where the whole notion of MTSS comes into play. And there's three key ideas that I want you to think about. The first is in the area of assessment of student performance. When we think about assessments, there's really four purposes: screening, diagnostic, progress monitoring, and outcomes. So what I would encourage you to think about is what are the different assessment measures you're currently using in your district, and what are the purposes of those assessments? Do you have any gaps? Do you have any redundancies? So when we talk about screening, that's all students. We're screening all students at multiple times per year to figure out who's on track, who's exceeding grade level expectations, who's below grade level expectations. Diagnostic assessments are given to some kids, not all kids, some kids, to figure out how to help them. What is it that they need as the instructional target? Progress monitoring tools are used for students that we're intervening with to figure out whether or not the interventions and the instruction that we're providing is effective in improving their trajectory of performance. And finally, we can use all of those different assessments to evaluate outcomes at the system level, at the building level, at the grade level, at the classroom level. So first big idea is assessment of student performance. The second big idea revolves around effective instruction and intervention. And here's where we usually talk about a multi-tiered system of support.
Now, about some of you are looking at this image and thinking, that image is upside down. But the point is, I want you to focus on general education and universal instruction, and when we flip the triangle upside down, our eyes are immediately drawn to that whole area of core instruction.
This top area, the green area, is our Tier 1 or universal instruction that all students are receiving. And we're expecting that at least 80% of students will be proficient just given universal supports alone. But knowing that there's not one thing out there that works for all students, we would anticipate that some students will need something above and beyond what works for most students, and that's where we drop down to Tier 2. And those are supplemental interventions in addition to what students receive at Tier 1. We're trying to target no more than 15% of students needing Tier 2 or supplemental resources. And then if we drop way down to the bottom of the triangle, we'll see that that's what we're referring to as Tier 3 or intensive supports. And those are for students that, despite quality core instruction, maybe intervening with something supplemental, that those students still aren't making good progress and need something more highly intensive and individualized. And that's where Tier 3 comes into play. Tier 3 does include some students that qualify for special education, but it will also include some students that do not qualify. The third big idea around MTSS is using collaborative teams to use data to make instructional decisions. So later on, when we talk about the area of infrastructure, we'll talk about the types of teams that are needed in order to make this framework successful. A few quick caveats in terms of what is MTSS, what is it, and what isn't it. First of all, MTSS is not an instructional program. It's not something that you go out and buy. It's a framework that we fit effective research practices within that framework. It's not the old way of doing business with a new label. So some of you may be in states where you've heard the term pre-referral intervention, where before a student can be referred for a special education evaluation, 2 or 3 interventions need to be tried and unsuccessful. The problem with that model is it's reactive. We have to wait for teachers to make referrals for students to get help. When we talk about MTSS, now we don't have to wait for teachers to make referrals. Our teams look at our screening and our progress monitoring data, and they can determine right away who are the kids that are likely going to need more support. MTSS is not intended to encourage placement of students. It's not about qualifying for Tier 2 or qualifying for Tier 3. It's really about looking at the needs of each student and what the resources are that are available in the building and matching those needs and resources to one another. It's not possible to implement alone. So that again goes back to the whole collaborative nature and using collaborative teams where everybody is embracing the notion that all kids belong to all educators in the building. It's not just the first grade or the 5th grade teacher and his or her 27 students. It's also not the same for every school. So I worked in an education district that had 21 buildings. And I will tell you that each building did things a little bit differently. So we can uniquely design MTSS for each site, but you have to sort of think about what the negotiables are and what the non-negotiables are. The real notion here is that we want to keep things flexible and adaptable, but still adhere to the fidelity of the underlying components of MTSS. Finally, MTSS is not a special education, a general education, a Title I, or a talented and gifted initiative. It's an every education initiative focused on systems change. So in other words, if I had to think of an acronym for this, I would call it really terrific instruction, that we're really taking research and best practices and using data to evaluate the impact of those practices in the context of collaborative teams of educators working together. So you may be asking yourself, why would a district embark on implementing the MTSS framework? And I can tell you that when I do presentations like this around the country, I ask this question to the audience, and these are the themes that I've gathered throughout the years of why people start implementing this framework. Some folks want to increase achievement for all students because of the accountability movement. Some districts go into it because they want to increase collaboration on the part of their teaching staff. Other people want to have a unified framework of academics and behavioral support. MTSS applies to both the behavioral side of things and the academic side of things. Other places want to allocate resources based on needs. Some places want to engage in non-discriminatory assessment practices. And other buildings or districts go at it because they have high rates of referrals for special education, and they really want to improve their continuum of services and options and really improve the universal instruction that all kids are getting.
Speaking of behavior, Dr. Joe Ryan provided a lot of detail about how the MTSS framework works for behavioral support in his webinar that was part of last year's fall series on school climate change. A recording of this excellent presentation is on the Presence Learning website.
Let's look at a couple of kids here and think about why the MTSS framework would apply to each of these kids. The first one is Clarissa. Clarissa's in 5th grade, and she's scoring at the 99th percentile in reading, math, and science on standardized tests. She has met the 8th grade spring targets in both reading and math. Work completion is sometimes an issue for Clarissa, and her parents and teachers are worried that she isn't applying herself. MTSS applies to Clarissa because this is a student exceeding grade level standards. Now, a student like this is arguably going to need as much differentiation in their universal instruction than a student at the 10th percentile. When we talk about MTSS, it's not just for the kids that are below grade level target, it's about all kids, and a student like Clarissa, if she isn't challenged appropriately, is likely going to have some issues with work completion, with boredom, and hearing those things, about that she's not applying herself. The next student is Zachary. So Zachary is in the 7th grade. He's meeting grade level expectations in both reading and math. His report card grades are mostly B's and A's. He likes school, and his teachers don't report any concerns. So think to yourself, why would the framework apply to Zachary? He's doing just fine. Now, when I ask this question to large groups, there's often a lot of silence, and people are thinking, I'm not sure how this applies to Zachary. But let me tell you a thought for you to think about. The MTSS framework applies to Zachary because we want to make sure that students like Zachary who start the year on target end the year on target. And when we look at our screening data throughout the year, if we start to see that we have a lot of kids falling off track over the course of the year, that's indicative of a universal instruction problem. Something is going on with our universal instruction that's allowing large numbers of kids to fall off track and not be proficient. Again, that's why the MTSS framework would apply to Zachary. Now, Cassie's in the 9th grade. She's scored in the partially proficient range on the statewide reading test since 4th grade. She's also scored below target on school-wide screening measures for reading since 4th grade. She struggles to keep up in her content area classes, and she thinks that she's not smart enough to go to college. Cassie is probably a good example of a student that's going to need some of that Tier 2 support, something above and beyond what all students get. She's likely going to need some support in the area of reading. She's likely not the type of student that's necessarily going to qualify for special ed services because she doesn't have that intensive of needs. But somebody is going to need to work with Cassie and really give her some strategies for content area classes and really work on establishing a growth mindset with her about going to college rather than having that fixed mindset that, you know, I'm not getting good enough grades or nobody else in my family's gone to college, so I'll never go to college.
During her upcoming webinar, which wraps up this series, Mary Morningstar will be taking a much closer look at how MTSS supports transition for students like Cassie and why MTSS is an essential component of your plan to ensure that students with disabilities graduate on time. So please plan to participate in that webinar.
Jesse, why MTSS for Jesse? He's in the 2nd grade. He's performing in the 4th percentile for reading and the 2nd percentile on standardized tests. He's also earning 4 office disciplinary referrals per week for noncompliance and work refusal. He's received supplemental interventions for the past 2 years, but he's made very little progress. So why MTSS for Jesse? This is probably a good example of a student that is going to need more of that Tier 3 intensive support, something that's much more highly individualized and intensive because of some of his lower skills in reading, that could be contributing to some of the behavior referrals for noncompliance and work refusal. The last sentence says that he has received supplemental interventions for the past 2 years, but has made little progress. That should sound like a problem to you. Some people have argued that RTI, or response to intervention, can stand for refusal to identify. And we want to make sure that we don't leave students in ineffective interventions for long periods of time. That's where our good efforts around collaborative teams and using data come into play, that we should have caught Jesse much earlier than waiting 2 years in an ineffective intervention. So hopefully those scenarios give you a little bit of a framework about how MTSS applies to all students.
Here is one of my favorite MTSS implementation resources, a set of guiding questions around MTSS that I want you to keep front and center in your office. That's why I'm included it in your resource packet.
If you take a look at the first questions, they all pertain to core instruction or universal instruction. So rather than jump in and look at your data and figuring out who are all the kids that we're going to intervene with and provide supplemental and intensive interventions, your first set of questions is really asking, is the core program sufficient? And if it isn't, how come? And how are we going to identify those needs and monitor whether the plans that we come up with to improve universal instruction are effective? Then we jump into questions 6 through 10 and start talking about who are the students for whom universal instruction is not sufficient and why. What do they need? How are we going to deliver that? How are we going to monitor the effectiveness? So keep those guiding questions front and center in your mind as we continue to move forward with the presentation. A couple of key assumptions that I want to talk about, specifically 4. These are underlying assumptions of the MTSS framework. The first one is that we want to move from sifting and sorting to multi-tiered serving. So in the past, we've done a really good job in education of creating a bunch of siloed programs, and we focus on labeling kids and putting them into those silos. How can we blow up those silos and really start to look at, regardless of labels that kids have, what are their needs? And how can we start to talk about those needs and the resources that we have available in our building and serve students based on the needs that they are presenting with? The second assumption is to shift our focus from struggling students to making sure that all students struggle. Now, why would I say that we should make sure that all students struggle? It's really that all students should be challenged, and instruction should be matched to each student's level, and all students should be working in their zone of proximal development. And that, again, speaks to the nature of collaborative teamwork and how we can talk about differentiated instruction and flexible grouping processes and frameworks to really ensure that we're maximizing student engagement. The third assumption is that the best place to start correcting learning problems is in the instructional process. So it's not to attempt to remediate some underlying neurological deficit. If a student is having problems learning to read, teach them how to read. If they're having problems learning how to do math, teach them how to do math. We know from the research that efforts to remediate process deficits prior to content instruction repeatedly have been shown to be unnecessary. So intervene directly in the skill area that you're concerned about. The last assumption is to focus on alterable variables. Now, what do I mean by alterable variables? Alterable variables are the things that you as educators have the power to control and change in the instructional day. I think that we spend far too much time making predictions about students' lives and far too little time making a difference in their lives. So if you look at this diagram, you can see here's the things that matter and the things that control, and what you should focus on are the things that matter for which you have control over in the instructional day. So if we look at this fish tank and we notice that the water in the aquarium is dirty, I would challenge you not to spend your time diagnosing the individual fish. Students don't learn in a vacuum. They function in environments that include the curriculum, specific instructional strategies, peers, and the way that schools are organized. So don't diagnose the fish. Change the water. When we talk about the water in education, that's the instruction that students are receiving, the way that our schools are organized. What's the curriculum that's being used? What does the environment look like? Those should be the focus of our efforts. So really, I think it's a shift in the question that we need to ask. And I think for many years, we've always focused on the student and asked, what is it about the student that's causing the performance discrepancy? Where really the question should be, what is it about the instruction, the curriculum, and the environment that should be altered so that students will learn and be more successful? This concludes part one of the presentation. Okay, we're going to move into part two of the webinar and talk about implementation and sustainability across 5 areas. But before we do that, I want to talk very briefly about how I'm going to embed some sustainability elements into the Big 5 area. Dr. Coulter and I wrote a book chapter in the handbook on RTI about sustainability, and we made the argument that in order to sustain really any type of systems change, you have to have leadership, you have to have a vision, you have to have infrastructure and data, resources, knowledge, skills, and self-efficacy, incentives, and implementation plans. I'm going to embed the pieces of the sustainability puzzle into the 5 areas of MTSS. So when we talk about implementation, the American Institute for Research, I think, put out a great resource tool, which will be included for you as a handout, that focused on 5 areas of implementation, and those areas are assessments, database decision-making, multi-level instruction, infrastructure and support, and fidelity and evaluation. The nice thing about their tool is there's a rubric that you can use as an anchor to really evaluate what level of implementation you're at in your district. So if you're at a partial level of implementation, you can use the rubric to see, well, what do we need to do to get to the next level of implementation? So we're going to start with the whole area of assessments. And I talked earlier about the purposes of assessments, that we need assessments that can be used as screening tools, diagnostic tools, progress monitoring tools, and for outcomes. But when we look at the specific tools themselves, first of all, we need to make sure that those tools are reliable and valid and have predictive validity to the ultimate outcome that we're hoping will be accomplished. Not only is it important for assessments to be reliable and valid, your staff should be able to articulate how and why the tools are meeting those standards of reliability and validity. When we talk about screening, screening refers to all students. We have to have procedures in place for conducting the screening and making decisions, and that's referred to as implementation accuracy, and it should be more than once per year. Once we collect screening data, we have to look at our screening data to make decisions about who the students are that are exceeding our expectations, who are the students that are on track with grade level standards, and who are the students that are below grade level expectations. We have to have an appropriate number of data points to make those decisions, and so it's widely recommended that we use our screening data plus 2 other data sources that converge to all paint a picture that, yes, this is a student that's going to need additional support, or no, this is a student that's doing just fine on grade level standards and will continue down that path. For the students that we are intervening with, we need to have progress monitoring tools. Those need to be reliable and valid. We need to have benchmarks at fall, winter, and spring intervals to compare student performance to. And when we're doing progress monitoring, we have to have multiple progress monitoring forms that are of equal difficulty, so that we're not always asking a student to read the same passage out loud or do the same math problem, that they're using different forms that have equal difficulty. And then finally, we have to have a progress monitoring process where we have schedules that are developed for students, and we have procedures in place to make sure that that process is being implemented accurately. So when you think about all of those areas, I just wanted to comment a little on some lessons that I've learned as I've reflected, over the last 10 or 15 years. I think 10 years ago you had districts exploring screening and progress monitoring tools. There was a lot of data collection but no data utilization, and there was a real lack of understanding of the purposes of assessment. Now I think we're doing a better job. We have lots of districts around the country screening students at multiple points per year. I would say that we're certainly at a stage where we're data rich, and maybe should even be asking ourselves how much is too much, and that's going back to the purposes of assessment and looking to see whether you've got a lot of overlap and redundancies or any gaps. And I still think that multiple sources of data for decision making remain problematic, and that's just in the work that I do out in schools. I just see an over-reliance on one screening data point to make pretty important decisions for students. Think about that and ask yourself, is that true or false for your building, for your district, or in your state? The second area of implementation is data-based decision-making. And here there's 3 things that we're looking at: process, a data system, and responsiveness. When we talk about process, we really want to make sure that decisions that we make about students that participate in interventions is data-driven, that it involves teams, and that it's operationalized with clear decision-making rules. We also know that in order for educators to use their precious time efficiently, we need to have a data system in place where educators can access data, where there will be timely graphical display, a process for setting and evaluating goals. And then finally, this area of responsiveness is when we're looking at data on student progress, those decisions that we make have to be based on reliable and valid data that are reflecting student progress or growth, or slope is another word, towards the ultimate goal. And those decisions need to be implemented accurately. If we think about the lessons from the trenches in the area of database decision making, how far have we come? I think a decade ago, decisions were not always based on data, but more professional judgment. Data systems, the question would be then, what are those? There was a lack of formal progress monitoring using reliable and valid measures, and really no clear decision-making rules. Now, I think there's much more emphasis on using data to guide decision-making. We have a lot of options for data systems, but I do think that there's challenges that remain in creating unified data systems that are easy to use. We have improved progress monitoring, but sometimes those progress monitoring tools are disconnected from interventions. And I think there's improved decision-making rules, but still confusion around the tiers and really sometimes a lack of understanding about what is Tier 1, what is Tier 2, what is Tier 3, how do those decisions pertain to students in a particular grade level or building. The third area is the area of multi-level instruction, and this is when we're talking about universal, supplemental, and intensive interventions. So we're going to start out with universal instruction, and I'm going to go back to another fictional story here that's called Moving Upstream, a story of prevention and intervention. And the story goes like this. In a small town, a group of fishermen gathered down at the river. Not long after they got there, a child came floating down the rapids calling for help. One of the group on the shore quickly dived in and pulled the child out. Minutes later, another child came, then another, and then many more children were coming down the river. Soon everyone was diving in and dragging children to the shore and then jumping back in to save as many as they could. In the midst of all this frenzy, one of the group was seen walking away. Her colleagues were irate. How could she leave when there were so many children to save? After long hours, to everyone's relief, the flow of children stopped and the group could finally catch their breath. At that moment, their colleague came back and they turned on her and angrily shouted, "How could you walk off when we needed everyone here to save the children?" And she replied, "It occurred to me that somebody ought to go upstream and find out why so many kids were falling into the river. What I found is that the old wooden bridge had several planks missing, and when some children tried to jump over the gap, they couldn't make it and they fell through into the river. So I got someone to fix the bridge." So I tell that story because the bridge here is universal instruction. And if you're spending all of your efforts jumping in and trying to save the children and develop interventions at Tier 2 and Tier 3, when you have a universal instruction problem, you're not solving the problem. You have to go at universal instruction. You're not going to have the resources available in your building to provide intervention support for probably more than 25 or 30% of your school population. So really think about that and really try to make the focus on, first of all, ensuring that your universal instruction is as strong as it can be. I like to use the analogy when we talk about tiers of instruction that if you're a carpenter and if all you have is a hammer in your toolbox, everything is going to start to look like a nail to you. And if you're a teacher and the only way that you can get support for students with academic or behavioral needs is through special education, then every student with an academic or a behavioral need will start to look like a special education student. So remember that tiers are resources, and we start with Tier 1, and then we're layering resources on top of Tier 1. We're trying to move away from a model where we have general education, special education, and then this group of students swimming in the sea of ineligibility, and really moving towards a model of general ed, general education with support, and special education for those students that have the most intensive needs. When we talk about successful multi-tier models, think about whether or not you have a continuum of services across the tiers that are scientifically based, and do you have methods of evaluating and monitoring progress across the tiers, ideally those considered scientifically based. Most successful multi-tier models have those two components in place. When we think about that first level of universal instruction, these are the things that we need to think about. Is the curriculum that we're using research-based? How do teachers articulate teaching and learning standards? How do they have conversations both within grade levels and across grade levels? How do we make sure that our instruction and curriculum are aligned to standards? What are we doing to differentiate instruction within universal instruction for all kids? And then what are we doing for those students that are exceeding benchmark? And that really relates to differentiated instruction as well. How are we going to make sure that those students remain appropriately challenged? When we talk about supplemental instruction or Tier 2, really the things that we're talking about are whether or not the interventions that are being used are evidence-based. Do they complement universal instruction? What are the instructional characteristics? What's the group size? Have we trained the teachers or the interventionists in the intervention that's going to be used? What's the dosage that they're getting? How many times per week? And then, of course, we want to make sure our interventions are supplemental to universal instruction. When we get to Tier 3, we want to make sure that the intensity of the interventions are matched to student needs. Again, that we've got an appropriate group size, dosage, people have been trained, and that there is a relationship to those grade level standards or the universal instruction that's in place. Many people that are working on intensifying interventions tend to use a problem-solving model to make decisions for individual students where they identify the problem, figure out why it's happening, link that to a plan where they develop a goal, an intervention plan, progress monitoring, then they monitor the intervention and then evaluate whether or not it worked. If we wrap up this area and talk about multi-tiered instruction, how far have we come? I think 10 years ago we had a lack of options for providing support to students aside from special education. Those pre-referral interventions lacked intensity, weren't research-based, and were largely more accommodations rather than an intervention. It was a reactionary system focusing on Tier 2 and Tier 3 where we ignored the core and really use of IQ achievement discrepancy model for identifying students with specific learning disabilities. I think now we do have more options and many districts are looking at a tiered model of supports. We're moving towards a proactive system where there's much more emphasis on core instruction. I do think differentiation remains a challenge along with interventions that complement core instruction. And we still need to keep the focus on all students, so not just the students that are struggling, but all students. And Tier 3 continues to be problematic, in my opinion, for students who don't qualify for special education but have very similar needs. That becomes very challenging sometimes for districts to address those needs. So we're going to move into the whole area of infrastructure, and if we embed some of these sustainability puzzle pieces right now, we're going to kind of hit leadership, vision, infrastructure, and data, and knowledge and skills and self-efficacy. But these are all the things that we're looking at in the area of infrastructure and support. leadership, teams, schedules and resources. How are we communicating? What are the resources and how are we providing professional development? And what happens if we don't have that good infrastructure built is chaos is going to result. And so we're trying to prevent that. Now, Dr. Coulter talked in his presentation about the first law of improvement, and really that the first law of improvement in sustaining MTSS or RTI is that every system is perfectly designed to achieve exactly the results that it gets. Therefore, although not all change is improvement, all improvement is change. When we move into this whole area of our sustainability factors within the area of infrastructure, leadership is a very key aspect of that. So principals, leaders, are responsible for over 25% of the variance on student learning. And they also impact the hiring, training, and retention of teachers who account for 33% of the variance on student achievement. So Dr. Coulter talked about how much leadership matters and that turnover can be a very big barrier in implementation when you have leaders that turn over every 15 months. Leaders are responsible for communicating a vision of high standards, creating an engaging and safe environment, encouraging leadership by others, that whole distributed and shared leadership model, and focus on improving instruction using data. A vision is important because it's supported by evidence and it helps staff understand why they're doing what they're doing. It provides a clear basis for the plan so that staff know where they're headed. And it leads to what I call initiative braiding, which I'll get into in a second, and also defines school culture. Initiative braiding, what do I mean by that? First of all, let me ask you if you've ever heard people in your district or your building say, you know, this MTSS is great, but our plate is too full. We have way too many initiatives going on in our building or our district. When you hear things like that, that's telling you that you need to intentionally and explicitly braid your other district and building initiatives into the MTSS framework so that staff understand how things fit together and that MTSS should help the district accomplish its goals. We need to figure out, you know, with the Every Student Succeeds Act, PLC, school improvement, PBIS, instructional coaching, how do those all weave together to support implementation of an MTSS framework, and how can we make that explicit? Without leadership, you're likely going to have anarchy, and none of us want that. Without a vision, people are going to be confused. If you're feeling like there's a lot of confusion that's going on back in your building or your district, think about whether or not there's a clear vision and whether staff know where they're headed and how different initiatives within the district are braided together. The next area within infrastructure is knowledge, skills, and self-efficacy. And this is, how do we give people the skills that they need to be successful so that they don't feel anxious? And a lot of times people will ask me, well, what do I do when I have all these people that are resistant to MTSS? And I often think that resistance takes the form sometimes of anxiety, because it's people that often don't think that they have the skills to function within the framework, and so they're anxious, and that comes across as being resistant. Think strategically about the professional development that you need, and how are you going to give teachers the support that they need. Be sure to watch the webinar sponsored by Presence Learning with Dr. Ross Green. He explains why lagging skills create anxiety and resistance and trigger behaviors that are tough for educators to deal with. A lot of districts are moving towards a coaching model, and this is just a quick slide from a study that was done by Joyce and Showers that was looking at different training components, whether people just listened to theory, had modeling by a trainer, practice, and coaching, and then whether or not people understood the concept, whether they used it, whether they could use it, and whether they actually applied it in the classroom. And you can see that adding in a coaching component really helps boost up skill attainment and classroom-based application. Again, without the appropriate knowledge and skills and teachers really having the belief that they can do it, that's that self-efficacy, you're going to have anxiety. The next area within infrastructure is teams, and I would just challenge you to think about the types of teams that you have in your district. Typically, there's 4 types of teams, some type of district level team that makes things happen at the district level, building leadership teams that work on making things happen for the school, grade level teams or core teams, data action teams, they're called all different types of things, but what's happening to help support the work that's being done at the grade level with groups of students, and then problem-solving teams that are really working on individualizing interventions. The one thing that I'll say about grade-level teams, because a lot of districts are using grade-level teams or PLCs, is just make sure that you're having enough meetings. Schools that realize the greatest shift to a data culture schedule meetings once a week. And so I would encourage you to think about the different teams that you have in your building, how frequently they're looking at data and making decisions, and make sure that that is sufficient. The next area within that larger area of infrastructure, which is that 4th big implementation area of MTSS, is resources. And really what I want to say about resources is just challenge you to think about whether or not you're aligning the resources in your district or in your building to match the needs and goals of your MTSS action plan. Think about professional development along with staff and curriculum, and really ask yourself, what do you have? What is needed? What's the funding? What does the funding look like? And are we going to have to kind of revamp the status quo in order to really align our needs to our resources? Resources are important because if you don't have resources, you're going to end up getting slow change. So that concludes part 2. We're going to move now into part 3 of this webinar, which is really going to focus on fidelity and evaluating our implementation efforts. We're going to start out and talk about fidelity. First of all, I want you to just take a look at some of these terms. If you were to peruse the MTSS literature, you would see all of these terms pop up in different research articles. And what all these terms have in common is that they're all getting at the degree to which a planned intervention is implemented as designed. So when we talk about fidelity, it's, are we doing what we said we'd do? Are we following the actual plan? Not only are we following the plan if it's an intervention plan for students, is the actual intervention being implemented appropriately and with the time and frequency that's needed? When we look at fidelity, there's lots of things we can look at. You can look at your district implementation plan. You could look at the fidelity of core instruction. You could look at the fidelity of interventions that are in place, using intervention scripts or direct observation. You could look at the fidelity of frequency and intensity of interventions and fidelity of progress monitoring. There's probably numerous other things you could look at too. But why care about fidelity or treatment integrity? We care because if we don't check on implementation integrity, you can't really be sure that interventions are being applied as designed. And if the intervention isn't applied as designed, progress or lack thereof really can't be attributed to the specific plan. When we look at fidelity, there's 5 elements that folks in the research have identified as things that we should look at. The first is student engagement. How engaged and involved are the students in the intervention and activity? You can have the best intervention in the world, but if the students aren't engaged, they're likely not going to achieve good outcomes. We can look at adherence, and that's how well do we stick to the plan, whether it's a curriculum that's being used or an assessment that's being administered. We can look at exposure and duration, how often a student receives an intervention, how long does it last. We can look at the quality of delivery, how well is the intervention, assessment, or instruction delivered, are good teaching practices used. And then finally, we can look at program specificity, how well is the intervention defined and different from other interventions that are available. I would really challenge you to think about this area of fidelity because it is so important. If you don't have confidence that you're implementing some of these areas that I've talked about with fidelity, then you really are going to have difficulty evaluating your implementation because of questions about whether or not you're truly implementing with good fidelity. When we move into evaluation, we're really looking at whether or not there's an action plan in place. How are we evaluating the plan, reviewing student data, and really looking carefully at our implementation data. So action plans are really the first step in all of this, and I will say that it's a step that is largely ignored a lot of the time. But your action plan doesn't have to be complicated. It's just a written plan that are addressing your key areas of implementation. So you could go back to the big 5 that we talked about today: assessments, database decision-making, multi-level instruction, infrastructure, fidelity, and evaluation. And what's your plan for implementing this year, next year, the following year? So you're going to set short-term goals, long-term goals, and figure out how are you going to communicate the plan back to other educators in the district and parents. And then how are you going to evaluate the plan? So if you're not getting good fidelity with your plan, it might not be that the plan was a bad idea. You might have just tackled too much at one time. So use that fidelity information to really guide your evaluation, your implementation efforts. McNulty and Besser, in a study from 2011, pointed out that the vast majority of improvement plans have too many goals and strategies. Consequently, the efforts of staff are spread across so many initiatives that they're rarely implemented effectively, nor do they then achieve the intended outcomes. So I would really encourage you in your action plans, again, to work on aligning your district initiatives within an MTSS framework and try to focus on a few things that you can train on and you can do well and then build off of that. I'll talk very briefly at the end that MTSS is not something that you go to a training on in May and then implement all aspects of the framework the following September. This takes time. It's a multi-year process. So really think strategically about what are your needs and then what are the things that you're going to map out to do to address those needs. When we look nationwide, a study that was put out by RTI Spectrum in 2010 found that only 48% of districts actually had an action plan nationwide. And action plans are important because if you don't have action plans, you're going to get a lot of false starts. So if you're sitting there listening to me right now thinking, oh my gosh, that's us, we've started and stopped and started and stopped, ask yourself whether you have an action plan. And if you don't have one, that would be a really good place to start. The final thing I want to talk about is just the whole area of evaluation and how are we evaluating the impact of MTSS or RTI. So there's lots of different ways to do it, and I'm just giving a couple examples out of many. But one is you could look at the percentage of kids at a particular grade level that are meeting your Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 targets and compare that to the spring. Now in this case, we see that we went from 74% of kids on track to 62% of kids on track. And we increased the percentage of kids that needed Tier 2 support. So this would be an example of some data that should cause a team to start to think about universal instruction and what's going on to cause kids to drop off over the course of the year. This is another way that you can look at your data. You can count up the number of kids that meet standards, partially meet, or do not meet, align it to whatever your state accountability test is. And you can start to look at the percentage of kids who stayed proficient over the course of the year. So here we can see that we had 150 kids that met the standards in the fall and 136 kids that met standards in the spring. When we divide those two, we find out that 91% of kids stayed proficient. Now you have to ask yourself, what's your target? I'd like to say that 100% of kids should be proficient over the course of the year, but some places say, we'd be satisfied if 95% of our kids stay proficient. This is just another way of looking at data so that we can see, are we increasing the percentage of kids meeting standards at Tier 1 and then decreasing the number of kids that need supplemental and intensive assistance. Just to wrap up here in terms of how far we've come, I think 10 or 15 years ago, if fidelity was assessed, it was based on asking how things were going. So we relied on self-report, and we would ask a teacher, how's that intervention working for you? And 9 times out of 10, you're going to hear the educational F word, which is the word fine. People will say, the intervention's going fine, but if we actually went in and observed, we might find that the intervention is not going so well. But people have a tendency to overestimate their reports on self-report. We weren't looking at fidelity of core instruction at all, training folks once on how to administer and score assessment measures, lack of action plans, lack of evaluation. And now I think there's more evidence on fidelity at various levels, and we're really incorporating direct observation into that fidelity system. Fidelity of core instruction still remains a challenge in my opinion. I think we're getting more action plans and certainly more disaggregation of data and looking at different subgroups of students and the type of progress that they're making. As we conclude, now I'm not going to give you a fictional story here. I'm going to tell you about an actual tree that grows in China, and it's called the mozo bamboo tree. And it grows in China in the Far East. And after the mozo is planted, growth occurs slowly for up to 5 years, even under ideal conditions. Then, as if by magic, it suddenly begins growing at the rate of nearly 2.5 feet per day, reaching a full height of 75 feet within 6 weeks. But it's not magic. The mozo's rapid growth is due to the extensive root system it develops during those first 5 years of getting ready. So I put that up there because, again, I said earlier that you are not going to get to a full level of implementation in 1 year, and growth is really not going to be linear. I would really challenge you to think about what are your next steps. You're going to see small improvements, but then once you get that good infrastructure and foundation built, you really are going to see that rapid growth and see those positive outcomes for students. How can you really do a good needs assessment of where you're at and where you need to go? The resources that will be included will include RTI Essential Elements worksheet that you can kind of walk through with your team, and then a Fidelity of Implementation rubric to objectively score your information. That wraps up the last part of the presentation. I see that many questions are coming in, so I'll now turn it over to Clay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim. That was fantastic. I really appreciated it. There was just so much in there. I loved how you worked in the focus on sustainability as well. It's such a key component that all too often gets neglected in discussion. So we have tons of audience questions, but before I dig in on those, I want to ask one general question, which is, what impact do you see on MTSS adoption and implementation as a result of the new ESSA, or Every Student Succeeds Act?
Thanks, Clay. That's actually a wonderful question. I really believe that the new ESSA legislation presents significant opportunities and flexibility for districts to implement the MTSS framework. The new ESSA legislation includes MTSS language, and it was really installed in legislation to provide school districts with a framework to look at the needs of students and develop a systemic response to those needs. It also codifies in law a definition of what it means to be evidence-based. In addition, it provides states and districts with great flexibility to blend different funding streams, such as Title I, II, and IV, to provide high-quality instruction, professional development, and those comprehensive learning supports, that are based on the unique needs of each school. So I would really urge listeners to identify who their district Title I director is and find out, if revenue is being used to support implementation. And I think that that the intersection of these of ESSA and MTSS, it's really positive and should be viewed by districts as a positive outcome.
That's great. How do you view the role of related service providers changing in this mix?
Well, if you go to the National Association of School Psychology, NASP website, you'll see that they have some talking points as well around ESSA and the MTSS framework. And I believe that many people think that the new reauthorization will provide much more access to school psychologists, as one form of a related services in the area of mental health, and certainly bringing in the expertise that school psychs have around academic and behavioral interventions.
Fascinating. Well, look, I'd love to get to the listener questions. We've got a ton here.
Okay.
But let's dig in.
All right.
What do you see? So, real foundational question to start. What are the differences between RTI and MTSS?
I'm glad that you asked that. It's interesting, when I started practicing in the schools in the early 1990s, the term RTI really didn't exist. We really just called it database decision making using a problem solving model. Right. And then RTI kind of evolved into this term that started to be used, roughly around the year 2000. And in 2004, when the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was reauthorized, there was language included that allowed districts to use a student's response to scientific research-based interventions to help make SLD entitlement issues. And so some people would maybe argue that RTI could be viewed more as an SLD entitlement decision making. I've never thought of that as the primary purpose. It's really just a byproduct of the framework. But then probably sometime around 2008, 2009, the federal government started using this term multi-tiered systems of support, and I think it was used to convey more of a systemic approach to improving outcomes for all students, right, rather than just a focus on the individual student and how they were responding to interventions. If you want my honest opinion, I don't really believe that there's practical differences in the two terms. But again, some would argue that the term RTI is associated with more of an eligibility framework, and MTSS
implies a broader framework. I think it's really all in the definition. And if you're a district that's screening all students regularly using valid and reliable measures, you're progress monitoring students who are at risk, you're implementing multiple tiers of support focusing on universal instruction, supplemental and intensive interventions, and you're creating an infrastructure for database decision-making using teams, then you're implementing RTI, MTSS, or whatever else you want to call it. There's many states that have defined it differently. So again, I don't really think that there's much practical difference between the two terms as long as we're adhering to that definition.
That's a really helpful perspective. It's easy to get lost in the alphabet soup here.
Yes, it is.
So I thought you did, I really appreciated you talking about how MTSS can vary building to building and some of the examples that you gave. And one thing that points out is just the importance of the role of the principal here.
Absolutely.
So I think this listener question is particularly important here. They're asking, what strategies have you found to be most successful in helping principals become leaders for the MTSS process?
Wonderful question, and thanks to those of you that have asked that, because I really believe, after working as an administrator in the schools for 20 years, that we need to understand that many principals also need professional development and support around MTSS implementation. When you look at the research, leaders account for 25% of the variance on student achievement. They're second only to teachers. And the research shows that successful leaders need to be able to communicate a vision of high standards, that they have to create engaging and safe environments, that they have to really focus on encouraging leadership by others, so that whole shared leadership value, focus on improving instruction using data, and really improving outcomes through coordination of services and communication between staff. So, as I said in the previously, they need to help set that vision and help staff understand the why around this. I also think that principals need to be fluent in their use of data to guide systems improvement. It was interesting, there was a Wallace Foundation study put out a few years ago that showed that when principals focused their efforts to improve instruction, and the teachers trusted the principal, that the principal was knowledgeable about their use of data, and there was shared principal and teacher leadership, that those three things resulted in higher student achievement. So just some practical tips for strategies to really help principals and leaders. In my previous district, where I worked with 6 districts, we had monthly principal meetings, and a portion of those meetings were always on MTSS implementation and really helping them troubleshooting systems issues. We created a lot of talking points for them to use both with parents and teachers in describing some of the assessments that are used in an MTSS framework, as well as practical differences between tiers of instruction. We helped organize screening data for the principals and really tried to get them to focus on using data to evaluate the impact of universal instruction. We did data boot camps for principals and taught them how to interpret screening and progress monitoring data using their own building data. And probably one of the more successful things that I did in my 20 years there was we had principals identify grade level team facilitators. So they picked teachers from each of the grade levels in their building, and that was really trying to get the focus on shared leadership. And then my organization trained these grade level team facilitators to guide the discussion with their colleagues around data. And then we required the facilitators to have at least monthly meetings with their principals to keep them folded in on the loop, updated on progress and issues. So that's a wonderful question, and our leaders cannot be ignored because they really do make the difference in implementation.
I think that's great. And you pointed out that principals, of course, are the sort of second, have the second most impact in terms of student outcomes. The first source obviously being teachers. And one of the things that motivates teachers is obviously, understanding why the school is doing MTSS and getting their buy-in. So could you talk about that part of the process?
Yeah, and that's a question that often comes up when I go out and speak. And
I said this a little bit earlier, but a lot of it doesn't really matter which state I go to. Many educators that I talk with seem to be experiencing, I guess what I'd call initiative fatigue. They feel like things are constantly being added to their plate without ever having anything taken away. And I think that, first of all, the biggest way to create consensus and buy-in is to start with that vision to help staff understand the why around MTSS, and in particular, help them understand that this is not another initiative that if you just wait it out long enough, it'll go away. That this is a framework that we're embedding research-based practices within. So, if you think about those vignettes, Clarissa and Zachary and Jesse, use those or create your own to emphasize that MTSS means improving outcomes for all students, because lots of times people initially think, oh, this is just about the students that are struggling, and help people understand that this isn't about, MTSS is not about qualifying. It's not about qualifying for Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3. It's really about matching the needs of students to the resources in the building. So, the other thing I think that really helps create that buy-in is when I talked about initiative braiding, and just really explicitly connect the initiatives going on in your building or district to the vision, and help them understand how it all connects to MTSS and improving outcomes for all students. So if you think about national buzzwords right now, Common Core State Standards, anti-bullying initiatives, educator effectiveness, college and career ready, results-driven accountability, achievement gap, I could kind of keep going on and on. We need to explicitly connect the dots for teachers and staff and show them how all of these buzzwords fit within the MTSS framework. And finally, I guess I would say that having a written implementation plan really reduces what I guess I call false starts, where you feel like you get started on something and you take 3 steps forward and then 5 steps backwards, and you're just continually starting and stopping. But I think those action plans help with consensus and buy-in, because it's a communication tool to guide implementation, and it kind of gives people that roadmap of where they're going. So and the final thing I'll say is that I said this earlier as well, that most of the people I run into that are resistant, it's often due to fear, and it's just fear that they don't feel like they have the skills necessary to be successful. So it's really up to leaders to make sure that we have the right amount of technical assistance, professional development, and coaching, to make sure that our teachers have the skills that they need to be successful in this framework.
I think that's right, and from what I've seen from my limited experience compared to yours is that it's oftentimes the skeptics who become the biggest converts. They're doing skeptical because they care and because they know what's involved. But once they cross that bridge, they're some of the most valuable people in terms of the implementation and driving this forward.
Absolutely.
So the next question, let's just get into it. So, what results do you see when special education and intervention departments work together as one?
That really has historically, that should always be the goal. We need to remember that general education and special education aren't 2 separate systems. They're all part of one system, rather than these 2 separate systems running autonomously. So when we talk about MTSS, we talk about different tiers of support. And, in the 8 years that I was a special ed director, I cared deeply about what happened at Tier 1 and Tier 2, because the more effective we can make general education, the stronger we'll make special education as well. So I think that, when Tier 1 and Tier 2 are broken or ineffective, special ed becomes the perceived answer. And there really aren't enough resources to support large numbers of kids, nor should we really be labeling kids with a disability when the cause of inadequate achievement is ineffective instruction. So I think, in my experience, I've seen a number of districts that are doing a great job with blending general education and special education, having special educators involved in problem-solving teams where they can help with intervention design and progress monitoring, co-teaching models where special ed services are pushed into during core instruction, and special educators can work with groups of kids that also include non-identified kids. So that was a wonderful question, and in my opinion, our outcomes will be maximized when we really do have those two systems working seamlessly together.
So we have another question here. I think people are really trying to understand the how of this, and they're trying to understand how are criteria developed for moving students up or down tiers?
So that's also a good question, because what I'm finding
You're making me feel smart here. These
are great questions. And sometimes I find that people are really kind of hung up on, well, how do kids qualify for Tier 2 and Tier 3? And it's really less about that, and it's looking at how large their needs are and the amount of resources that are required to address those needs. So when we think about Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, at Tier 1, we're trying to maximize the percentage of students who reach our target scores that are set at different screening intervals. And districts use different methods to develop those target scores. Some use local percentiles, and they will look at their screening data and say, okay, our target score is going to be the 60th percentile, at the fall, winter, and spring. Others use a criterion reference target where they correlate their screening measures to the statewide accountability tests, and they come up with these predictive scores on the screening measures that if the kids reach that score, they have about an 80% chance of being proficient the next time they take the statewide accountability test. So at Tier 1, you're kind of trying to get about 80% of kids proficient. But then again, you want to use that data to evaluate the percentage of kids who start the year on track, who end the year on track. And that, you want to have at least 95% of kids who start the year out just fine, end the year just fine. And then at Tier 2 and 3, that's where we really need to have valid and reliable progress monitoring tools that are administered regularly. So at Tier 2, we usually start out with, group interventions. Some people use the term standard treatment protocol, where you identify an intervention, for reading, for math, for behavior that is going to address the needs of that group. But then you collect regular progress monitoring data. And when you look at your progress monitoring data, you can use what a decision-making rule that many people use is called a consecutive data point rule, where if you have 3 data points in a row that fall below where you expect the student to be, you make some type of instructional change. And the more instructional changes you make, and the more that you have to individualize and intensify instruction, you're going to work your way up that tier process. When you get to needing quite a bit of support and individualization, you're likely going to be receiving Tier 3 supports. And when I say Tier 3, I don't imply that that's all special ed. Right. So that's a good question.
So I think we have time for one last question here. And the question is this. What does research suggest about the role of technology, including blended and online learning, in implementing successful MTSS?
I love it. Love it, love it, love it. And this is my opinion, and I'll fold some research in too, is, technology has come a long way, and it can be really good, especially for practice interventions for kids that are working on fluency. But I think we need to remember it doesn't always replace a teacher. Teachers need to really ensure that the technology being used is appropriate for student needs, and they need to monitor progress regularly and recognize that there is a role for teachers and explicit instruction and providing that real regular feedback. I have had the opportunity to work with a number of online schools, and I would say that the most successful ones that I've worked with for students who are at risk are those that I would sort of call a hybrid model, and they include a combination of face-to-face and online learning. So 2 examples of online schools I worked with created systems where students could come to a location and work on lessons online, but have access to adults that could help them if they had problems and get that immediate help. Another school had math teachers available 2 days per week for 3 hours where kids could sign up for tutoring. Others assigned students a case manager or a homeroom teacher and require weekly video chats to review progress. But interestingly, some research that we did here at the University of Minnesota was looking at flipped instruction, where students were provided instructional videos to watch at home, and then they came to school, and the instruction was largely helping kids work through assignments and problems. And one of the things that research found is that for kids that were really at risk and had challenges, particularly in math, that the research found that there were many challenges with flipped instruction. The students reported that the videos were too long.
Right.
Kids were reporting it's hard to learn math watching these videos at home, and they weren't as engaged. So I think we just have to recognize that technology is good. Flipped instruction can be good, but we just have to recognize that that it doesn't mean that that's going to be good for everyone, and we need to be flexible and open. And it really goes back to collecting regular data to see whether or not kids are successful with whatever instructional format we're using with them.
I think that's right. You can't use the analogy of if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think the same is true of technology. It's just another tool in the toolkit, and you need to continually monitor to see if it's the right tool for each kid.
Absolutely.
So, look, this has been tremendously helpful. Thank you for your thoughtful answers, for your time, for the wonderful wealth of content and lessons that you brought to us here. But unfortunately, we no longer have time for questions. So,
all right. Well, thank you very much.
A lot left, so thank you. So just a few messages for our audience here. Stay tuned because there's information on how to take the survey and get credit in here. So please stay tuned in. First message is to clinicians. If you're interested in making a career move or know someone who is, we are expanding. We're hiring speech therapists, occupational therapists, school psychologists, and social workers. So you can work from home while making a big difference in kids' lives. If this type of contract opportunity sounds good to you, please check us out at plearn.co/apply-to-PL. That's plearn.co/apply-to-PL. I promise to get a shorter URL in the future. I'm also excited to announce that we can now perform psychoeducational assessments online. So in partnership with HMH, we recently released the results of a rigorous, independently verified study that demonstrated that live online administration of the Woodcock-Johnson Cognitive and Achievement Tests by credentialed school psychologists on our platform produced equivalent results to traditional on-site administration. So the results are equivalent, online and offline, which is a big finding, and we are now the only firm authorized to provide these assessments online. So please contact us at schools@presencelearning.com to arrange for a demonstration and see how this works. The schools we're working with tell us that it could reduce their assessment backlog dramatically and that it ends overload for their school psychologists. In terms of our webinars, a recording of our first webinar with Alan Coulter and today's webinar with Kim Gibbons are going to be available on demand starting today. We also invite you to join us for the third and final webinar in our fall series, December 6th with Dr. Mary Morningstar. Mary is going to be providing expert advice and answering tons of questions on transition strategies for high school students. We always do a lot of surveys, see what people are interested in for these webinars, and transition issues are perennially towards the top. So it should be an interesting and exciting one for all of us, and it's based on your feedback. If you'd like a certificate of attendance, please stay online and take a short quiz covering today's topic. At the end of the program here, you're going to get the quiz as well as a survey. So if you take the quiz, a score of 80% or higher gets you an email with a link to your certificate of attendance. If you don't pass it first, you are allowed to retake it, so go ahead and do just that. ASHA members, we're going to submit your attendance to ASHA right away, but it can take a few weeks for them to update your records. NASP members, your certificate will contain the information you need to self-report for CPDs. We'll also email all of you a follow-up link to a recording of this webinar and all the resources that we mentioned here. I encourage you to share this link out with your colleagues. It's all totally free, and there's good information there. And you can also, as always, tap into our huge archive of SPED Ahead webinars. We have over 40 professional development programs from our expert faculty. And lastly, thanks to all of you, the listeners, who make this possible. All of us at Presence Learning are committed to helping you close the achievement gap, and a big part of that commitment is to give you advice from the world's most respected experts, like Kim, to our professional development webinars. Once again, if you'd like more information about Presence Learning, Woodcock-Johnson Cognitive and Ability Achievements, achievement assessments online, or any of our other services, including speech therapy, occupational therapy, and other types of assessments, just email us at schools@presencelearning.com or visit our website. Thank you so much for making us part of your day. Have a wonderful day.